Hello, my name is Jeremy Roberts. I'm a Senior Director at Infotech Research Group, and in this video, we're going to be talking about standardizing the service desk. And I know what you're thinking, don't click away. This is actually really important, and there's 3 reasons we wanted to make this video. The first is that the service desk is incredibly visible. It is the window for your whole organization into IT. When most people on the street think about IT, they're actually thinking about the service desk, the person who takes their call. They're not thinking about enterprise architecture or CIOs or any of that other deep technical stuff. No, they're thinking about the person who takes their call. So getting the service desk right, absolutely essential to building your reputation as an IT leader and a top performer. The next reason is ubiquity. Every single organization of any size has some version of a service desk, whether it's formal or informal, they're everywhere. Because the truth is, you can't be in business today, or in government, or any type of nonprofit organization without having a technology organization. And if you have a technology organization, you're going to have issues. That's just an inevitability. So it's very important that we address the service desk and make it as good as it can possibly be, because they're everywhere. And if we do it right, well, of course, we're going to affect a lot of different areas. And the final reason, of course, is exactly that. It's impact. So many people will interact with their service desk, and they won't receive the help that they need. And that's not a positive outcome, right? The reason they're calling the service desk is because they need something, or something's broken, something's not working as intended. And so getting the service desk right can be a way to keep your organization on that smooth path towards profitability or assisting citizens or towards whatever mission you happen to be supporting. And so we've broken it down in our Standardize the Service Desk research into 4 phases, so to speak. And this video is going to be broken up into 4 phases. The first is first contact, when you get in touch with the service desk. The next is when the ticket enters the ticketing system, the ITSM solution, whether that's ServiceNow, whether that's Freshworks, whether that's something else. Then, of course, you're going to have to route, you're going to have to work, you're going to have to process the ticket. That's phase 3. And then the final one is ticket closure. And so we're going to talk about each of those in turn as we proceed through the video. So with that, let's start with first contact. And no, we don't mean aliens. This is not the type of first contact that we're talking about. And so when we describe first contact, what we're really saying is when the user right here gets in touch with the technician that they're working with. Now, they can do this in a bunch of different ways. It's not always a phone call, although that is a very common method. They can do it via email. They can do it via a text message. They can do it via a walk-up. They can do it via the ticketing system. They can do it via some other method like smoke signals or carrier pigeons or something less efficient than that even. But it's key that they get in touch with the service desk agent. A challenge, a big challenge, one that we've seen across pretty much every organization that we've worked with is, well, it can actually be quite hard for users to get in touch. What's the service desk number at your organization? How do you get in touch with your help desk? Maybe there's a portal, that's great. Maybe there's a phone number that you've memorized, like 222 or something like that, or an internal extension. But in many cases, people don't actually know how to do this or that they should be doing this. And so a big challenge that end users experience, this top row is all end user stuff, is they don't know how to get in touch with the people who are going to help them. And so they suffer in silence. And so an important thing that any service desk leader should do is make sure that end users not only have a viable way to reach the service desk, but that it's been well communicated so that they're familiar with it. And of course, that you're reaching people in ways that are comfortable to them. So if you have a team that's distributed across, a large geographical area, they maybe don't have computers that they've been given by the organization, you probably want a phone number that they can reach via an outside line. If you're based in an office, got a lot of foot traffic, maybe you want a desk that they can walk up to for assistance and take a ticket, like at a deli counter. And then, of course, if you've got a bunch of remote employees who are used to operating via a portal, like a SharePoint site or something like that, maybe you want to have a ticketing system that's available via a portal, and we would advise that more broadly. So that's the first challenge that you need to remediate. The next is a lack of self-help. So every time you put it in a ticket, every time this person gets in touch with this person, well, there's a potential to drop the ball, right? They have to articulate their concerns effectively. They have to make sure that they are putting it into the right system. And then these folks actually have to intake it and work it properly. But that doesn't always happen. Anybody who's ever put in a ticket and felt like they were sort of throwing it into a black hole and it was devoured by space-time, That's been a relatively common experience. They know what I'm talking about here. So when wait times are incredibly long, this can be frustrating because people are typically contacting the service desk, these folks up here, because there's something impeding their ability to work. They don't call just for fun. Okay, that's what the number on the back of the toothpaste is for. These people are calling the service desk because there's some impediment to their ability to do their job. And so those wait times being long, hugely impactful, something that can be assisted via self-help. So what does self-help actually look like in a service desk context? Well, the first thing you're going to want is some sort of a knowledge base, right? Some sort of a place where people can go to look up common issues, or frequently asked questions, whether it's a chat bot that crawls a database, or whether it's the database itself that's publicly available, searchable via keywords, tagged and all that. You're going to want to address this problem because there are some users out there who really want that help, who really want to be able to just take those resources, solve their problem themselves, and get things off the plates of the busy help desk agents. And then the final challenge here is, of course, wait times. Okay? If you've got to wait a long time to be served, that's going to be a big issue, and it's twofold. As I mentioned earlier, obviously it's not good. You're calling the service desk for a reason. You want to be addressed, but it also erodes faith in the service desk. And what I mean by that is if people call and they get hold music, yeah, it might be great hold music. I love it when they play Top 40, for example, when you're on hold. Well, if you call and you're getting hold music, you're probably going to be less likely to call next time. And one of the biggest, most fundamental challenges from a technician perspective is people not using the portal or not logging tickets. And a reason that they might do that is because their wait times are so significant that they try other methods to get their problems solved, right? So these are three end user problems. It's hard to get in touch. There's a distinct lack of self-help options available. And when they do reach out, it takes forever to solve their issue. The next piece is the technician problem. So no one uses the portal. We built it and they did not come. This is a tale as old as time. Often IT systems are buried somewhere. There's a really long URL. There's not been a tradition of using these self-help tools up here because maybe they haven't existed previously. So when we do build a portal, shocker, nobody actually uses it. And so then you have a bunch of people calling you and tackling you and sending repeated follow-up emails into the ticketing system or into a general mailbox, for example, that take time and effort to address instead of people using a very clean portal system that might offer self-help options or direct people towards knowledge articles or even just help them categorize tickets appropriately so that they go to the right team if that's the way that your service desk is set up. Another challenge, and this one sometimes is experienced maybe not on the end user's behalf, but it can be an issue for IT teams, is that there is no ticket that's logged. So an end user has an issue, they might do what we call a hallway tackle, which is they see somebody and they say, hey, you work in IT, you can solve my issue for me. And the IT person puts their coffee down, sighs, and says, yeah, I can help you with that. And they walk over to the computer and they restart it, or they run a diagnostic or something like that, and they solve the issue, and then they just go about their day. And the ticket isn't logged. And you might say, that's great. We've eliminated bureaucratic overhead. But the reason we like logging tickets is that we get an accurate picture of the amount of work that we do. Imagine a technician who is too busy to log tickets. Imagine them going to speak to their boss and trying to get budget for additional resources. Your boss would say, you only did 10 tickets last week. So no, you gotta log them. When that doesn't happen, it ends up creating friction sort of down the line. And there's incentives from all parties to not do it, but I would argue that the incentives to do it are much greater. And then the final challenge here is that users are contacting technicians directly. I talked about the hallway tackle. It doesn't have to be a hallway tackle. It can be a Microsoft Teams message. If you're watching this and you run a service desk or you work on a service desk or you've ever done any sort of internal customer service, you received the dreaded, hey, Teams message from a colleague. You want them to use the portal, but maybe there isn't one. You want them to try and troubleshoot the issue themselves. Maybe there's no troubleshooting tools available to them that they can access easily via a portal or a website or something like that. Maybe they don't know how to get in touch with the actual service desk, or that there is a process. Maybe they're unfamiliar because maybe they have very few IT issues, or they are just setting up a new product or something for the first time. They're not familiar with the appropriate way to do it. But whatever the cause, they end up contacting technicians directly. And when you contact a technician directly, you jump the queue. And again, it might seem like just being available is a good thing. You want your users, because visibility is such an important part of the value proposition of improving your service desk, you want the users to feel like they can go to you with issues and not have to go through all this bureaucratic process. But the reality is, when you reach out to a technician directly, you are circumventing prioritization. You might not be reaching out to the right person. Maybe they're on vacation, maybe they're on lunch, maybe they're on break. We can't allocate it effectively, so you might be slowing the response time. You are gumming up the works. They can't use their teams effectively because, of course, it's clogged up with people attempting to reach out to them directly. And of course, it's a misuse of the fundamental sort of portal system, the ITSM solution, right? That exists as a way to centralize that intake, and by going to a technician directly, you are taking them off their assigned mission, potentially, if they choose to help you, thus, again, impacting your coworkers maybe in a less than beneficial way. So that's why first contact is so essential. You got to get first contact right, because if you don't, your users might end up doing things like going elsewhere, avoiding the portal, not logging tickets. Your technicians may not be able to log tickets because the right people haven't reached out to them, and of course, they might contact those technicians directly, circumventing the process entirely. So in order to avoid that, what you do is you got to make it easy to do the right thing. There should be a self-help toolkit available so that users can find what they need. The portal should be highly visible, well promoted. Technicians should direct people towards the appropriate intake channels. Tickets should be logged always, and managers and supervisors should keep track of this. There should be a service level agreement for wait times, and it should be very clear to end users how they should get in touch with you. And if you do all of those things, you can manage first contact without causing intergalactic conflict. So after we made first contact, assuming that we do everything right, the ticket is going to enter the ticketing system. And every organization does this a little bit differently. Some use a big module-based system like ServiceNow. Some might use something a little bit smaller. Some might use something homegrown that they built themselves. But ideally, there should be a system that is tracking tickets through their ticket lifecycle. And so at this point, the things that matter are the creation of the actual ticket, populating it with relevant information. Who sent it in? What's the nature of the issue? If it needs to be directed to a particular team, what's going on there? Right? And as they are working the ticket, they should be updating it with relevant information. They should do triage. Not all tickets are created equal. In fact, not all tickets are even incidents necessarily, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video. But the idea here is that in a tiered generalist service desk model, prioritization typically looks like a priority 1 or priority 0, right down to a priority 4 order. And so if the entire site is down, or the entire company is down, or a critical system is inaccessible, or something is broken, it's customer-facing, citizen-facing, what have you, it's going to be a much higher priority, a 1 or a 0, and that's going to result in a much more severe reaction from the IT team. Escalation is going to be faster, more people are going to be involved, the service level agreement, the SLA for resolution is going to be much more quick, because of course, you need to get that system back online. Versus a priority 4 or severity 4, which might be something like the printer in my cubicle area isn't working, but crucially, there's another one that I can use, maybe on a different floor. And so it's not an immediate impact. And so we usually do prioritization based on impact and urgency, with higher impact, higher urgency tickets getting a higher prioritization, and lower impact, lower urgency tickets getting a lower prioritization. As a quick note, this prioritization should not be done by the end user. I've seen many systems where when you input a ticket into the system, you are given the option to prioritize it. And end users will typically say, yeah, it's very important to me. And so it gets bumped right up, and you do not want somebody's printer being down to become a severity 1 or severity 0 incident, because that would be problematic. And the final relevant element here is the actual resolution itself. So once the ticket's been intook, I don't know what the correct past tense of that is, and then it's been triaged, you're going to have to resolve it, assuming that the status you give it is one that requires resolution. In some cases, tickets are entered in error. And at this point, either the technician is going to work it, typically that tier 1 technician, or it's going to be escalated up to a different group that has the specific expertise or access to resolve it. And that's not done typically when the ticket enters the system, although it would be great if it was, wouldn't it? Now, just as with first contact, there are a series of challenges. So let's talk about those. So when we look over here, a big challenge that end users face is that they don't get a response when they submit a ticket. They send it into the void and they get nothing back, and they're not aware that anybody's actually processed them. So a good practice is to have a response SLA that should be quite tight, 10 to 15 minutes, maybe at most. And some folks say you should do this based on severity. I actually disagree, because you don't know how severe it is until you've looked at it. And if you've looked at it, you can have the common courtesy to give a response. A good response email, if it's submitted via email or via the ticketing system, will include a summary of your various prioritization and severity levels, along with service level agreements that are attached to each of them. So if you submit a ticket, you've triaged it as a level 3, let's say, maybe there's a 2-day SLA for resolution on that. That should be communicated to the end user to avoid this challenge of no response. Another challenge that they experience is exactly what I just alluded to, which is a lack of ETA. So they submit a ticket and they just hear, we're working on it. And they say, when's it going to be done? And the person doesn't respond to them, the technician, or they don't direct them to the appropriate source for that information. They don't share the standard service level agreements and the templates and so on that govern the SLA. That ends up being a huge problem. End users get frustrated. And if you've ever worked in tech or any type of customer service, really, at this point, the end users start to escalate. They might call the infrastructure director or the CIO and say, so-and-so is not working my ticket. And then if they are amenable, the CIO will pour that difficulty right downhill, right back to the service desk, and then there's an improper prioritization happening that's not in line with the overall goal of a good service desk, which is to triage things like a hospital would, right? So giving a user an ETA can really nip some of those concerns in the bud. But if you choose not to do that, those end users, they can get frustrated, and then going back to the point we made in the first contact segment, they might not trust the service desk and they might not go to the service desk. And when they choose not to do that, well, that creates a bunch of problems as well. And then, too much back and forth. This is incredibly annoying for both the end user and for the technician, which incidentally is why it appears here twice. So the idea here is that when you submit a ticket, the end user doesn't submit all the relevant information, or the technician doesn't ask for all the relevant information. Then they have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth to fill it out. You know, what building are you in? I'm in building A. What floor are you on? I'm on floor 2. What system do you use again? Oh, I'm in this HR system from the company you just acquired, and so on. All that should be delivered in the creation of the ticket and when you intake the ticket up front. And this is why a portal is incredibly helpful. You can prompt the user to give all of this information versus the more unstructured methods like phone or email or walk-ups, right, where people might just tell you what they think is important versus what's actually relevant to you. And you can automate some of this as well, so you should be tagging assets, for example, to tickets. You should be tagging users automatically to tickets if they're logged into a portal when they submit it and so on. But too much back and forth just completely ruins the experience. And everybody has encountered this before, where somebody asks you for something and then they don't get back to you, right? And then finally they do, and then you have a follow-up question, but they're on vacation for 2 weeks, so you've got to let the ticket sit and you can't resolve it. The inverse can be true as well if you're working with a support person who's also out of office. So this is a huge problem here, too much back and forth. It just creates friction, and every time you hand the baton off, there's an opportunity to drop it. And so you should avoid handing the baton off insofar as that's possible. So end users don't like any of this. And if we look at the technician challenges, which we've listed sort of across the bottom here, tickets just sit in the queue. So if nobody is working them via triage, once they go into the queue, they just sit there unassigned. And that's typically a status that exists in a ticketing system. And that's no good, because users don't get the ETA, they don't get the response, and then they get frustrated and the ticket doesn't get resolved. And this can have a bunch of implications, not only for the company, but it can be a resume generating event if it happens frequently enough. And so when tickets sit in the queue unassigned, they need to be effectively assigned. And this can create a bunch of its own issues. So potentially some technicians might cherry pick potentially easier tickets. Tickets might be assigned to technicians who aren't capable of resolving them if the queue management isn't done effectively at that lower end. So this is a huge problem. You don't want tickets to sit unassigned, and you should create service level agreements
within your service desk team to avoid the challenge of tickets sitting in the queue. There should be an upper ceiling, a limit on the amount of time that a ticket can sit in the queue unassigned. Next is improper categories. So every organization should have a categorization scheme, and that typically will cover the nature of the ticket. It can be asset-based, it can be service-based. We don't recommend going any deeper than 3 layers and maybe like an 8x8x8, which still gives you plenty of tickets, by the way. I think that adds up to 512, but we'll put the right number on the screen if that's not the right one. Still gives you plenty of tickets options without being too overwhelming. And if they get it wrong, then the ticket might eventually be routed to the incorrect team. So let's say a ticket comes in and it's a user complaining that their laptop is slow. And so the first stage, they create the ticket, they put it under hardware because it's a laptop issue. They attempt to troubleshoot it, they don't get very far, and then they escalate it. And the next tier at tier 2 is the hardware team in this example. And it turns out that the actual issue was SharePoint was slow. So it should have been the Microsoft 365 team, not the hardware team. At that point, the miscategorization has created that too many hops problem, that too much back and forth, because it's going to go from tier 1 up to tier 2. Tier 2 is going to look at it and say, that's not me, and they're going to kick it back probably to tier 1, who then has to look at it again and send it to the correct team. Ideally, there'd be some lateral movement there, but not every service desk works that way. So improper categories creates difficulty in escalation, and it also messes up reporting. I once worked for an organization where they just decided that categories, while they existed in the system, didn't matter, so everything was filed under network issue, which some of the admins watching this will probably say, yeah, everything is a network issue at its core. But in this case, they were filing everything under network issues, and at the end of the month, they got a pie chart that was just one color, and it was not useful from a data perspective. They didn't know where to hire, they didn't know where to direct their resources, specifically because they did not take advantage of the categorization feature here. And categories, by the way, are useful for more than just the tickets themselves. They're also useful for coordinating your knowledge base, that self-help toolkit that's going to be so essential when we're talking about first contact and when we're talking about shifting resolution to the left, which is a concept that we've propounded quite extensively at Infotech. And so you want to make sure that you get those categories right. And the next piece is that too much back and forth, but this time from the technician perspective. So from an end user perspective, my ticket's taking forever, they're not asking me for all the right information, and so I have to keep giving more. From the technician perspective, the end users might be a little bit too cagey, they might not be using the appropriate intake channel so that they can't be prompted in advance for the correct information. And that creates a ton of headache. It's hugely problematic for the technician because they have to go chase that information down. And in response, many organizations have shot clock pause functionality built into their ticketing systems. So while I'm waiting on a response, I might switch the status of my ticket to waiting on response from customer, and that should theoretically pause my service level agreement. So if I have 8 hours to solve a ticket and I email somebody with a question, I may be able to pause those 8 hours. And that sounds great, except the challenge is that can be very attractive as an incentive, as a way to keep your numbers nice and good, nice and healthy. So technicians may take advantage of that to, again, pause the clock a little bit. So this is what we want to avoid. We want to avoid too much back and forth, and we want to get those tickets resolved within the prescribed service level agreement with as little headache reaching out to the end users back and forth as possible. Once the ticket's entered the system, it becomes incredibly important for you to route it, work it, and of course, resolve it. And so, what does this entail? Well, essentially, it's getting from the ticket intake to a situation where the ticket can be resolved and then ultimately closed. And it's important to note that resolution and closure are not actually the same thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So this portion of the life cycle typically involves troubleshooting on the part of technicians of various degrees. So at a normal organization, it might look something like this. The ticket comes in, it's delivered by maybe phone, maybe by email, as we've talked about. It goes to a tier 1 technician. Let's say they're a little bit early on this journey. And that tier 1 technician looks at it. And maybe they'll give it an hour, 2 hours. They'll try and solve the issue. They'll say, so-and-so can't log into the system. Why don't we try resetting their password? That doesn't work. They might try something else. And then at a certain point, they can't handle it anymore. So they escalate it. And now they can get back on the phones, take more of these relatively higher priority tickets in, and they've given it off to a specialized team, usually tier 2. And now tier 2, sometimes they're committed to ticket resolution, incident resolution. In other cases, they might be specialists who only resolve tickets sort of part of the time. So this could be a security team, this could be an end user computing team, this could be a hardware team, this could be a network team. These are all relatively common tier 2s and tier 3s. Then a similar process applies. The ticket is assigned to them in the ticketing system. They attempt to resolve it. Ideally, the tier 1 technician has made notes as to what they've already tried. At this point, the tier 2 technician, or the tier 3 if it gets escalated further, would reach back out to the end user directly instead of working through that tier 1 agent who's already attempted to troubleshoot and resolve the issue. And they would try and resolve it. And essentially this escalation chain would continue until you either run out of escalation points or the ticket is ultimately resolved. If it's not resolved, you may need to declare a disaster depending on the type of issue that it is, or put it in a database of known errors. So that's really the routing, working, and resolution process in a nutshell. Where the challenges come in for the end user are no status updates. So if the ticket is taking longer than normal to resolve, it's very important that we alert the user that we are handing the ticket off. So typically, when a ticket is initially assigned to anyone, a first-tier technician, a second-tier technician, we should be alerting the end user who's working their ticket. We should give them an ID, whether it's a name, a number, depending on the type of help desk that you're running, and we should give them the appropriate priority and the service level that's attached to that priority. When the ticket gets handed off, so it goes from tier 1 to tier 2 or tier 2 to tier 3, it's important that we then update the user and let them know that their ticket is sitting with somebody else and that somebody else might be reaching out to them. For example, years ago, I had an issue logging into an HRIS system, and I went through the normal process because I practice what I preach. I eat my own dog food. I drink my own champagne. And so I contacted the help desk, and they worked it. Didn't work out all that well. I ended up actually meeting and befriending a system administrator because it became such a deep technical issue that we needed the actual administrator of the system to resolve it. It turns out having two people with relatively similar names is problematic from an identity management perspective if you're not using an SSO for a particular system. But that's all water under the bridge now, as we like to say. So this can be a fundamental problem here. Users don't know what's happening, they get frustrated, and when they get frustrated, we already know the drill. They call your boss, they call their boss, and what used to be a relatively minor issue becomes a major issue, and it doesn't warrant that level of attention. It's a distraction. It pushes things that should be prioritized out of the queue. So how do you resolve this? Well, in your workflow, you should have various points where you will always notify the user. Typically, it's upon receipt, resolution, closure, and of course, any escalations or changes in category or prioritization that are going to be impactful to the end user, they should be aware of that. So status updates, the challenge can be resolved by actually just providing them and building that in. This can be automated. It's not rocket science. Unless you work for a rocket science company, then I guess it could contribute to rocket science. Now, from a technician perspective, there are some challenges as well. So over here, we've got a bigger backlog, okay? So what this means is that tickets pile up. And so if you're an escalation recipient, right, there's a whole bunch of tickets that you're going to work. This might not be your day job. The backlog grows and grows and grows and grows. Maybe you're not updating users, so they're bothering you about it. You're not clearing them out effectively. This needs to be resolved. This needs to be addressed. Whenever I go do work with service desks and they've got backlogs that are months and months and months long, my first thought is, well, these end users have completely lost faith in your ability to actually resolve their concerns. And as we said earlier, when you pass off the baton, that's an opportunity to drop it, and an escalation is a baton pass, and so the backlog can grow if this isn't handled effectively. End users also likely want to deal with a single person. Some people say one throat to choke. I prefer one hand to shake. But they don't typically like being pawned off. It's a common complaint is that they're being bounced around between technicians, and so we want to avoid that insofar as it's possible to reduce the impact of the substantial backlog. Another challenge is silos. I can't see you because this is a video, but raise your hand if your organization is highly siloed. That's a common experience in basically every place I've ever been. There's always some sort of a demarcation between functional groups, and everyone has experienced somebody saying, oh, geez, I would help you, but that's not my job, or that's this team. And so a common thing that happens is it gets escalated from tier 1 up to tier 2, and then tier 2 says, ooh, I know the user said that was a security issue, but it's actually an identity issue. They need to reset their password, so you need to go give that back to the identity team. And then the identity team says, well, I know that it's a password reset issue, but this user is attempting to reset their password from a different location, so they actually need approval from the security team or something like that. And then that tier 1 technician who just wants to get it resolved and doesn't have the access or permissions or expertise to resolve it is stuck dealing with an organization that is highly siloed. And this can have implications in other areas as well, not just routing. It can matter for working the ticket as well. So for example, the expertise to solve a problem might be concentrated in one small group or even within a single group, concentrated in an individual. Certain people at organizations, especially those who have been around a long time, have a lot of contacts. They can be what I call load-bearing in the sense that they're holding up the walls of the organization. And that's a huge problem from a siloing perspective because we want that knowledge to be spread as widely as possible. Because anybody who becomes a bottleneck in a process becomes extra critical. And if they're not available for whatever reason, and we're all human, you know, we go on vacation, we win a ton of money on The Price is Right and want to celebrate. Well, of course, we're not going to be available to solve that issue. And until we come back, and we might not even come back if the amount of money we won on The Price is Right is significant enough, until we come back, there's not going to be a way for us to actually resolve that. And so how do we address the silo concern? 2 words, or 1 word, depending on your convention: knowledge base. People at those upper tiers need to be writing down the techniques that they're using to resolve common tickets. They need to be writing those knowledge articles, and they need to be sharing them with people at different tiers and across the technology organization so that the silo risk is mitigated substantially. Everybody needs to be able to access the same pool of information. You should not have 2 entities pursuing parallel tracks in resolving an issue. There's nothing worse than somebody spinning their wheels for hours trying to solve a problem or an incident, to use the correct ITIL term, when somebody else has actually already solved that incident and they just weren't aware of it. So silos, massive issue. Not just for storing grain silos, they're for also impeding your ability to run an effective service desk, it turns out as well. And then the final challenge here is improper escalation. And I alluded to that earlier when I talked about the security team kicking an escalation back because it was supposed to be for the identity team. Well, this happens all the time. A ticket comes in, it's described one way. The end user facing technician might not be as familiar with the ticket as they otherwise would have been if it was an area that they were an expert in. And so they escalate it to a team that they think owns the ticket, but that team rejects it for whatever reason, as we talked about earlier. Or the technician does not take all appropriate troubleshooting steps and escalates it anyway, and it's something that they should have resolved. And from an end user perspective, a technician who should be resolving the ticket, escalating the ticket, the person receiving the ticket, kicking it back down, saying this is actually something that you should resolve, that's a terrible experience because it adds a whole bunch of those potential baton drops. It's much more expensive for the organization because theoretically those tier 2 people and tier 3 people are going to be paid more generally or have day jobs that are more valuable in air quotes to the company than the junior technicians who would be working a ticket. So this improper escalation ends up costing everybody. And so what can you do about it? There's a whole bunch of things that you can do about it, but there are a couple that stand out. One is, again, propound that knowledge base. Make sure that everybody involved has access to and is contributing to the knowledge base. Many times, folks at that tier 3, that tier 2 level will complain about an improper escalation, but they haven't actually bothered to train the people below them to not escalate those tickets. So they should be contributing to that via knowledge base. And then, of course, technicians should be trained to go through all appropriate troubleshooting steps via accessing the knowledge base, via peer discussion before they escalate. And then a final way that you can address this is by building a field into your ITSM solution that tags when a ticket has been improperly escalated so that that tier 2 technician or who have you, they can identify to their management, which is ideally the same management sometimes as the rest of the IT team. They can identify those circumstances where the escalation has been improper as training opportunities so that they don't happen again. And if you have one technician who is very consistently escalating tickets inappropriately, that's a huge training opportunity, and the role of service desk technician might not be for them if they just want to hand stuff off repeatedly. And this, of course, can also be a symptom of metrics, right? if my goal is actually just to get a ticket off my plate as quickly as possible, to adhere to some metric, like perhaps a service level metric or a ticket completion weekly or whatever, that can impact this number as well. And again, it's a very bad experience for the end user who are ultimately trying to serve, because of course it takes longer for them to get where they need to be. So all of this needs to happen before we move on to closure.
Ideally, once you've finished your resolution attempts, it'll come time to close the ticket. But this is a whole phase in and of itself, and it's something that people don't always get right. So we'll talk about ticket closure, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can improve the various things that we've discussed over the course of this video. So let's get into it. Ticket closure. We put a door here because I guess that's the closest thing in the Microsoft graphics package to something that closes. And as we mentioned earlier, there is a distinction between resolution and closure. So a ticket that's been closed ideally should not be reopened. It should go into your known error database. If it's an error, it should be living forever in your closed tickets repository, tickets with that status. But ideally, once a ticket is closed, it should be because it's been completely resolved. Now, resolution is simply your indication to the end user that you've resolved their issue. Closure is them accepting it. So that's sort of the distinction. That's what's important to know about this process here. But again, there are some challenges that have emerged in our research that we aim to address with our Blueprint Standardized Service Desk. So the first of these for end users is the ticket is closed too early. If you've ever experienced this, there's a number of reasons that it can happen, but essentially it's when you submit a ticket as an end user, the technician receives the ticket, and then they say, oh, this isn't an issue, or I fixed it, they close it, and you get a response saying, whoa, 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 as a technician, you shouldn't have closed that. You didn't actually solve my issue. You left it open, or I'm not satisfied with the resolution. So the ticket needs to be either recreated, reopened, whatever. And there's a bunch of reasons that this might happen. A very common one is that technicians are usually metriced on their ticket volume. They're tracked based on how many tickets they close over a given period. And so if they are not closing a high number of tickets, if tickets stay open for a very long time, they're going to get dinged on their volume SLA and probably on their resolution time SLA. Mean time to resolve is a very important overall service desk metric because it helps us create an appropriate schedule, helps us target appropriate volume of staff and technicians and so on who are necessary to do this work. So when a ticket is closed too early, it could be because the person resolving it has an incentive to do that ticket closure. So this is something that we definitely want to avoid. The end users don't like it because, of course, it doesn't build faith in a service desk that cares about them, because obviously if they haven't checked back to make sure that the ticket is resolved early, then I think obviously they haven't been paying enough attention. So how can you avoid this? Well, a common thing to do is to have two distinct settings in your ticketing system. One for resolution, there should be a ticket status, and then one for closure. And when you mark a ticket as resolved, it should notify the end user, and the end user should have an opportunity to either close the ticket themselves, wait 3 or 5 days, however long you want to give them, to let the ticket close automatically, or they should be able to reopen the ticket. They should be able to respond and say, actually, the ticket wasn't resolved to my satisfaction, let's reopen that. And so the end user should always be the one confirming that the ticket is resolved, not the technician. Certainly not without giving the end user an opportunity to weigh in. Another challenge is a lack of feedback opportunity. So in many cases, in fact, the vast majority of cases I've ever seen working with service desks, end users love their technicians. They love them. Response rates to surveys are relatively low. Generally, they're in the single digits, honestly, with organizations that I work for, even with various incentives like entering a draw and whatnot. But the number of folks who actually meaningfully can contribute to how a service desk runs is very small. So we recommend, to avoid this challenge around the lack of feedback or opportunity to provide feedback, there's 2 things that you can do. One is institute a ticket closure survey and send it to every single ticket recipient. Every time you close a ticket,
an end user should get a survey asking what their experience was like. And as a service desk manager, a supervisor, a team lead, you should be actioning all of those negative responses. Hopefully there aren't too many of them, because they can be a great opportunity to point out spot issues. You know, my ticket was closed too early, the technician was rude to me, that sort of thing. And at a macro level, those numbers can be okay barometers of how you're performing. But again, your sample size is going to be relatively small. And this should exist in every single ticket. So everybody should have an opportunity to provide this type of feedback. What should the survey look like? Probably a 1 to 5 scale, opportunity for comments. Don't get too much fancier than that. Pretty much every ticketing system, every ITSM solution is going to have this as an option. And now I know what you're thinking, because I can see through the camera, can read your mind. What you're thinking is, that's great, but that doesn't give me a ton of detail. It's not cross-sectional. My response rate is going to be low, as you said. Correct. Another thing that you can do to provide folks with an opportunity for to provide that feedback, is to do an annual, or probably not quarterly, maybe semi-annual survey. We call them diagnostics at Infotech, where you ask a lot more detailed questions of a broader number of folks, and then you track that year over year. So we call it our end user satisfaction diagnostic. And the idea is that you ask dozens of questions, not one question. You ask about all the different facets of IT. How satisfied are you with end user computing? How satisfied are you with network performance? How satisfied are you with the service desk, and so on? And you can drill down into all of those areas that are just too detailed for a specific ticket. And you can get a general feel, a general sentiment from your audience versus just the very specific one. And then as a bonus option, you should always have your door open as a manager. So if people want to come to you and provide feedback on your process, they should feel able to do that. IT shouldn't be walled off from the rest of the organization, because we talked about silos earlier and the problems that they have, that you encounter as somebody working in a silo. I mean, this is an extension of that. So we want to make sure that feedback is honestly taken. And another piece of advice on this, absolutely action the feedback that you get if it's valid. If people keep telling you what they want and you keep ignoring them, they're going to stop telling you what they want. So make sure that you do that. Now, another challenge here is breached SLAs. So let's say you close the ticket, the door closes, the deadbolt shuts, but it's been 3 days and it was supposed to be 2. This is a huge issue, because your SLAs don't matter unless they are consistently enforced and not regularly breached. That's just the reality. So you should have a target for your technicians that's attainable. The A in SLA stands for agreement, and so it should be communicated to your stakeholders. You should agree with them about what an appropriate resolution time is for tickets of different priorities, or for service requests, which we haven't talked that much about in this video, but future videos, stay tuned, for them to be fulfilled. And if they're not consistently being fulfilled, you need to take steps to actually address that. Whether it's renegotiating the SLA, whether it's improving a process, you should be doing postmortems if you are not effectively meeting those targets that you've agreed to meet. Because again, if you are consistently not hitting SLAs, there is an opportunity for folks to go around you. They'll go to your boss, they'll go to their boss, it'll become a big issue. And with a silver lining for IT maybe, although it doesn't sound like this would have a silver lining, it is also an opportunity for you to demonstrate that the agreed upon targets aren't sustainable, assuming that your staff are doing all of the appropriate work to attempt to meet those SLAs in the first place. The next challenge here is poor end user satisfaction scores. Okay, so this is sort of the corollary, the other side of the coin for no feedback opportunity for end users. For IT groups, it's poor end user satisfaction scores. The challenge here, of course, is that they're doing everything that they can to close tickets on time, to resolve issues appropriately, but people are still not happy with them. And I always say, you can't convince somebody who's not happy that they actually are happy. So arguing with them about whether they should be happy or not is probably not the most effective way to approach this. But what you can do is you can use the feedback that you gather to target your efforts to address areas that are most important to the angriest people, the loudest people, right? You're not going to be able to fix every problem. That's just the nature of management. But what you can do is prioritize effectively, and using the feedback that you get via those end user satisfaction surveys that occur annually or semi-annually, and by using the specific feedback that you're getting from ticket closure surveys, you can address the specific concerns that are bringing those scores down. And you should be tracking them regularly, and you should be able to show a trend line. If your Net Promoter Score is, plus 15 one year, it should be plus 20 the next year, or plus 30, or plus 80. That'd be a really good Net Promoter Score. And more broadly, now that we've talked about sort of the 4 phases, the first contact, the ticket entering the system, the routing, the working, the resolution, and of course the closure, we've got some high-level advice. And this is advice that you can take home sort of across the board here. The first is, we want you to identify your goals. Look, the reality is that different service desks are set up for different things. If you've ever worked for a large telco, for example, your goal might be to get people off the phone, whether or not you resolve their issue. That's just a sad reality, right? And the customer service is hived off completely from the rest of the organization. If you work for a boutique investment firm, your goal is probably to get your advisors, back out onto the phones or onto the floor as quickly as possible, whatever the cost may be. Most organizations probably sit somewhere in the middle. You need to figure out what you are trying to do so that you can build a plan to actually accomplish it. And this sounds so silly. As we were writing this on the whiteboard, my thought was, do the people watching this really need us to tell them that they need to identify their goals? But years of experience working with service desk teams tells me that yes, in fact, that is needed, because often there's a mishmash of different inputs that make it difficult for us to focus on a singular direction. The next is improve your intake. Figure out what channels are most appropriate. Double, triple, quadruple. I don't know what the word for 5 is. Double down on that, okay? This is ultimately going to be where you have the most impact, is actually getting those tickets into the system, getting a true picture of the volume that you're experiencing, that your technicians are needing to address on a weekly, monthly, annual basis, getting a real picture of it. And if you improve the intake, you're going to both get end users to actually play ball, which as we know, they don't always do. Sometimes they tackle your technicians in the hallway, and you're going to have those realistic numbers so you can fund the organization that you need to meet those. Ultimately, if there's a whole bunch of stuff that exists in the shadows, you're going to be in really, really big trouble because your budget is not going to reflect your reality. And again, intake, that's where you lose the most people. That's the top of the funnel. Make sure that you address that. And then everything else should follow, assuming you adhere to best practices. Next, capture and report on good data. That's part of the reason that we want you to do intake well, right? Is you want to have a good picture of the volume. Well, that data admonition, it covers the entirety of the service desk. We want to have good data in tickets. We want to have good data about who is requesting. We want to have good data about resolution time. We want to have good data about escalations, about prioritization. We want to be able to slice and dice that information so that we can make intelligent decisions about where to focus our efforts and ultimately to improve end user satisfaction scores. If we don't do that, we're going to be in massive trouble, and we're probably, could be a resume generating event, as I said earlier, if you're a CIO who's overseeing a service desk that's failing so spectacularly because of the visibility and the criticality of the service desk organization. The next thing you can do is document your workflows. The number of times I've showed up on site and said, how do you do this? And we had like a 2-hour-long conversation about how a ticket goes from point A to point B, but nobody has any documentation to show me. That's hugely problematic. If something exists in your head, it doesn't exist, okay? If you are a solo performer, you don't need to write your script down. But if you're hiring actors to appear in your commercial, guess what? You got to write it down. And if you are a solo shop, you're probably not really a service desk, so much of what we've talked about here probably doesn't apply. So make sure you document your workflows and occasionally poke at them, maybe not with a stick like this, but say, is this the most effective way to be doing this? Where is the friction in this process? Where are the challenges? And as we put together our standardized service desk material, which you should go download off our website, by the way, infotech.com, that's what we work through. We build service desk workflows. We have a whole bunch of standardized ones that might actually be relevant to you and your organization because the process is fairly similar. Some of the details change, but the overall bones of the beast are quite similar. And then finally, shift left. And we'll probably put a diagram up on the screen here so you can see this, but the idea here is that on the right of this diagram, right, you've got the most expensive people. These are going to be your tier 3 technicians, your vendor support. And we don't want to be escalating tickets all the way to the right, up through self-service, then tier 1, then tier 2, then tier 3, then to the vendor. That's incredibly expensive, takes a long time, downtime costs money as well. You're looking at thousands of dollars to resolve an issue versus maybe cents if it's done in an automated fashion. So what you want to do as the service desk lead and even as an end user is find the most effective, speedy way to resolve your issue most of the time. And the vast majority of tickets should not be escalated at all. They should be resolved by the self-service portal so resolving a password issue, for example, or if it's a service request via a self-service catalog, or they should be resolved by tier 1 technicians who are devoted to this, who have the processes in place, and who don't need to hand your ticket off. And so if you do these 5 things, and if you adhere to our 4-phase framework, which you can find in our Standardize the Service Desk blueprint on infotech.com, I think you're set. So remember, standardize the service desk. Service desk is critical because it's highly visible, it's extremely ubiquitous, everyone has one, and the impact of improving your service desk operations is substantial. Thank you for watching, and again, check out the blueprint at infotech.com.